as Russ said at the beginning, you can, there are a lot of paths you can go, and you can start, kind of go in more the startup and industry world. I've been in academia since I got my PhD since in 1994, and as Russ also said, to me, translation is important because the kind of work that I do, which is not surgical robotics, but more in the rehabilitation robotics, so wearables, lower limb exoskeletons, and prosthetics for people with limb amputation. The point of that work, obviously, is to improve quality of life, improve mobility, improve functionality, improve recovery, whatnot, basically improve quality of life. And there's lots of ways to do that, and writing, contributing to the science is an important way to do that. But the most direct way to do that is to translate it, to make it available so people can use it. And so that's been an important part of my mission, I guess, in that if we do something in the lab that we feel like has value to the people who can benefit from it, then we want to translate it. And also, I don't mean to just parrot everything Russ said, but as Russ said, some of the most rewarding experiences for me have been when people, users of this, have come to me, and I don't even know how they know necessarily that I'm involved. Not that a lot of people come to me, but I try not to advertise necessarily that I was the origin of this particular product. But at any rate, when they do come to me and say, I really appreciate this, it's made a big difference in my life, that is probably the most rewarding aspect of what I do. Okay, so all that being said, my model has been very different from what Stefan said, in that I've remained in academia. I've decided to license technology because it enables me to keep doing what I do, which is be a professor, advise students, mentor students, conceive of ideas, write proposals that are higher risk than most businesses might be interested in pursuing or able to pursue, and pursue those ideas within the academy. So anyway, this has been my model, and so what I would like to do is at least describe my experience. As Pierre said, I have some experience licensing a few different technologies. This one is the one that's furthest along, so I'm going to focus on this one and hopefully convey maybe some lessons learned with regard to that model, developing within an academic environment and then licensing out to a company. All right. So I'm going to spend actually just a couple slides on the overview of what this particular product is, so you get some sense of it, and then the rest is lessons learned. So as far as what this is lower limb exoskeletons, basically wearable robots, got motors at the hips and the knees that provide movement in the sagittal plane. It's got basically everything on board, right? It's got onboard battery, it's multiple onboard microcontrollers and control system. As far as what it does, it either behaves as an assistive device, which is something that, a device that helps somebody move, right? So it provides leg and mobility to other people who are otherwise non-ambulatory, or if somebody is poorly ambulatory, then hopefully it improves their mobility so that they have at least limited community mobility and can access places otherwise inaccessible to a wheelchair. And then also has a therapeutic function, which would have different software associated with it, but that is used inside of a rehabilitation clinic that facilitates functional recovery. And the primary populations that might use it are people with spinal cord injury, muscular sclerosis, cerebral palsy, and/or stroke. So just as a example, this is a woman who's poorly ambulatory, or what we call poorly ambulatory, has incomplete spinal cord injury. She has an AFO, ankle foot orthosis, on a right leg, and knee ankle foot orthosis on the left. She can walk with a lot of effort and in a way that would not be considered limited community mobility or community mobility. In other words, she couldn't cross the street before the light changes, right? And also she wouldn't have the ability to ambulate sufficient distance. And so with an exoskeleton, the same woman the next day, but obviously she can walk much better and at a rate that's appropriate for community or limited community ambulation. Okay, so briefly, the timeline, there's kind of a lot on the timeline and a lot more I could have put, but and it's also hard to say when something started and when something's done, but here are some, I think, important. I kind of tried to throw in some important milestones here, but roughly speaking, this was funded by the U.S. National Institutes of Health. That's a 5-year grant and started in, let's say, 08, so sometime in the middle of 08, but in 08, 5-year period of performance. About 4 years later, well, 1 year after it started, we were testing in a rehab hospital, and then 4 years after we started, we licensed to Parker Hannifin, which is a large company, and then 3 years after that, we went through FDA trials, and then a year after that, in 2016, it got FDA approval and had also at that time the CE mark, and so has been for sale for the last 3 years. And sales have been, it's been well received. Sales have been, I guess, exceeding expectations. But at any rate, the rest of my talk is lessons learned. So, yeah. So as far as I guess I just to the extent that my experience is transferable to other people, I think some of it is. I thought I might just discuss or present some points I think that I've learned and maybe have been useful and that are best practices. So I divided this into these 6 bullets. Just development best practices. And I have only a few things to say there because I think people who are going to do research or are doing research know how to develop technology. But, and then creating value when you license, protecting that value. Who wants what you've licensed, what you've developed? And this is something that maybe is, I think I've learned some, or maybe gained some insight into that. And then successful handoff, I think I've gained some insight into that as well. And then maybe some other lessons that I've learned as well. Okay, so best practices. I would say the number one best practice from my perspective is to involve clinicians and clinicians who are, in our case, I think the best clinicians involved were physical therapists, people who work with the patients on a daily basis and kind of have boots on the ground, so to speak, really know the patients well. When we wrote that NIH proposal, wrote it with a hospital called the Shepherd Center in Atlanta, Georgia, in the U.S. It's one of the leading rehab hospitals in the country, and we were very intentional in writing it with them because we felt like you're not going to make something, or we're very unlikely to make something that is impactful without that level of input and testing and feedback that the clinicians provide. And so I think also, and Stefan mentioned in his last slide, the idea of usability. Those are huge issues, and I think one of the reasons why this has been well received is because we considered many usability issues from the start, and those include, I think I'll mention them a little bit more later, but no exposed wires. You can't make something where somebody can walk past the doorknob and have a wire, yanked out. It's unacceptable. So no exposed wires. Easy to don and doff. Take it on, take it off. Put it on, take it off. Easy to carry around with you. Things like normally locked knees. If the power goes out, what do you want to happen? What needs to happen? No wrist-worn controls. No crutch-based controls. No backpack. You can sit in an armchair. No built-in shoes. Those things were very important from the beginning, and we made a long list and made sure that we abided by it. We prototyped early and often, and we revised a lot. We solicited feedback from the clinicians and the patients and used that to revise a lot. Things like this particular guy who has it on, one of the first prototypes we had, from an engineering perspective, when you transmit forces to the body, you don't want to transmit moments to the body. The body's not good at that. You want to transmit forces, but you're at the joints, obviously, fundamentally transmitting moments. So if you want to minimize those forces, you want the attachment points to each of the long bones as far apart as possible. So that's what we had. He thought that it would be a problem because people with spinal cord injury a lot of times don't have bladder control, and they use they're catheterized and they have a leg bag. And with this interface up too high, he couldn't use the leg bag. That's a usability problem. We didn't think of that until first time we tried it on him. We went back, we changed it, and came back with something that wouldn't interfere with his leg bag. That's just one example of many, many examples. And the other important thing about involving clinicians is involving them and making sure you incorporate their feedback is that it ended up earning their buy-in, and they became real champions of this technology. And in fact, the first companies that were approached for licensing were approached not by us, but by the clinicians. Not even, we didn't ask them to do that, but they did anyway. At any rate, okay, that's kind of, this is an example of this usability, this modularity, right? We made this so you can snap it apart into 5 pieces. And so the idea was, in part, so you can carry it with you, because you have to be able to carry it in your wheelchair. I mean, something that somebody else has to lug around for you is not real useful. You need something you can put in your lap, you can put in the passenger seat of your car and whatnot. But the other thing is self-donning and self-doffing. You don't want to have somebody, the idea of this is independence. So you don't want to have somebody to have to put it somewhere and you have to transfer you into it and so on. So this was very difficult to do, but we thought it was important. Difficult in the sense that making a robotic system that has distributed electronics, distributed power in a modular system is not easy, and the control system has to be designed so that information is transferred in packets, and so that if a packet is lost, things don't, the operation remains safe. So there was a lot of thought that went into that, but again, usability is very important. Okay, so our value proposition, I'm going to talk about like our specific case because that's what I can, and then I'm going to try to generalize it. But so this was licensed by Parker Hannifin. Parker Hannifin's a $14 billion company, or their 2018 sales were $14 billion. So why would a $14 billion company want to license what a university does? It's somewhat unfair to call them a $14 billion company because they are, but they're like a company of companies. So, so there are a lot of different divisions. But at any rate, they had the resources to do this themselves if they wanted to, but they didn't have, they decided they wanted to enter this medical space. They didn't have the know-how, they didn't have IP, they didn't have directly related experience. So in effect, they wanted to do an acquisition, but you know, they can't acquire university technology, and there weren't other people doing this, or not in the, not with as compelling, I think, let's see, not with other efforts were not as far along. We'll put it that way. So basically, licensing our technology enabled them to go to market quickly and with less risk. And time is a big issue sometimes as far as getting to market at a certain point. When we wrote this proposal, there were no lower limb exoskeletons. During our period of performance, then Rewalk emerged, and then later Exo emerged. So this time to market was important. So our value proposition to them was we had a demonstrated technology with strong differentiation. I mentioned some of that. These bullet points there show you some of that differentiation. Nobody else had that. It's interesting, the fourth bullet, with no backpack, no wrist worn, crutch mounted, no integrated shoes or foot plates, no exposed wiring, that was unique at the time. And as I wrote those down, I realized that now the rest of the market has moved in. That's not unique anymore because ours came out with that, and then now that's become kind of the expectations of the market. At any rate, an IP portfolio, we had at that time 3 patent applications. Now it's more. We brought to them, you know, several years and some government investment in the development, and also the buy-in from clinical partner was very important to them. Okay, so I think in general, the value you create is similar to that of you know, if I were to generalize our value to Parker in that case, and this has been the same for other licenses that we've done. People basically want to buy a package. They're looking for a go-to-market package that includes, you know, demonstrated efficacy, some differentiation from whatever's on the market, and a strong IP portfolio. And in doing that, you know, the closer to pre-product you have, the better, the more attractive it is, and to have demonstrated that it has whatever the intended value is also, I think, very valuable to those potential licensees. Protecting value is also super important. Nobody will license without IP. So, and you need probably not one patent, but a portfolio. You know, the way the businesses describe it to me is it's kind of like you want this successive rings or barriers, right? So if some other company breaks through one barrier, they've got another one sitting in front of them. They break through that barrier, they got another one sitting in front of them. So a single patent is not going to be enough. A single patent won't dissuade other companies from suing, basically. So you need a portfolio. As far as patents, you know, at least in academia, nobody teaches you how to write a patent. It's kind of an art. It's interesting. I think I've learned after a number of years. I think I have, I don't know, 35 U.S. patents now, something like that. But at any rate, I always draft the spec and the claims myself. I've learned not to leave it to a patent attorney. Maybe some really good patent attorneys can do it, but I don't think in my case, they don't know enough to do it. They don't know enough of the specific landscape to do it. I think in writing it, you have to you can describe something a bunch of different ways, right? You can have a bulleted list, this describes what I'm doing, but you need to take that bulleted list and the order in which you bullet it is very important. And you need to start with the biggest point of separation and build everything from there. And then the rest of the details can be described in the bulleted claims. So that's an important exercise, important in writing patents. And then obviously patent before publication, and sometimes patent instead of publication. There's also know-how that's really important. A lot of the electronics that we made are actually the same electronics, essentially, in a more hardened form, but the same electronics that are in the product. Those we licensed as schematics and whatnot, and you can just copyright that. At least in the US, you can do a registered copyright, and that codifies that know-how. But you need to balance this academic disclosure versus patent protection, and that's just, these are two worlds that are in conflict, right? It's a hard thing to balance. Academics is all about you know, full disclosure, and to the extent that somebody can reproduce what you've done, and that would terrify a business, right? To know that here, this is what I've done, full disclosure. So you just need to do both, and I don't know that there's any other way to say it and balance it. But if you want something, just to go back to what I started with, if you want to translate, if you want people to be able to use this, you have to patent. And I learned that actually early. My advisor, Woody Flowers at MIT, he felt like he was doing work. He was doing lower limb prostheses, and it was funded mostly by the U.S. National Science Foundation. He thought it was funded by the government. He shouldn't patent. And so toward the end of my master's thesis, we sat down with a company that wanted to license it, and we had a lot of talks with them. They said, don't publish. So I didn't, and they did due diligence, and they came back after a year and said, you know, there's been too much that's been published already. We can't license this. And so it was really too bad, because for him, that was 15 years of his life trying to make something that would improve quality of life for people. And because he was trying to share it and make it public, it ended up never being public, or never getting to the point where somebody else could use it. The people who he wanted to use it were not able to use it. So I learned that early. He learned it late. It did, you know, the postscript of that story is it was eventually made. It became the Rio knee, so it was eventually made into a product, but it took several years and some more patents to do it. At any rate, all right, so who wants it and who doesn't? This is something that I've learned. You know, I originally thought that if we were doing something, let's say a new prosthetic leg, that somebody like Otto Bach might want that. But that's usually not the case. Somebody who's already doing something in a certain space probably doesn't want what you have. They don't want something that makes their product better. They want to sell their product. They've already bet on a horse. They've already invested a lot of money, and they want return on that investment. And so if you have something that's going to compete with it, that's just going to cannibalize their own product line, and in my experience, they don't want it. They might pretend like they want it because they want to know what you're doing. They'll sit down and meet with you, but they're not, in the end, probably going to license it if it's not going to, if it's going to compete with their own product. I guess the same is true with improving methodology. You have, you know, we have controllers that will go in the exoskeleton that we license to Parker. They'll just go seamlessly in. They're not written right now to be FDA compliant. I think they are better They function better than some of the ones that are in there. But it doesn't make sense for Parker they won't put it in unless it's going to sell more devices. If it makes a big enough difference to sell more devices and to pay for the additional investment in coding it in, then fine, it's going to make the money, they'll put it in. But just because it's better, they don't want it. So you have to there's just a little bit of a different mindset in business, I think. I think if you want to license to somebody, you're better off looking for somebody who doesn't have that product, wants to acquire that capability, or somebody who has a product in an adjacent field and wants to acquire something that they don't have already, right? It enables them, gives them an expertise they don't have, it gives them access to a market that they don't currently have. So that's the way to look. It's also, the other thing I've learned, last thing I'll say on this, is that you're unlikely to go and sell somebody something that they didn't already know they wanted, right? So the businesses have strategic plans. In our case, everything we've licensed has been to a business that's already decided they want to go that direction, and they're basically they're looking for technology that's aligned with their strategic plan. So that's hard to know because businesses don't publish their strategic plans, but it's hard to sell somebody something that they haven't already decided they want. All right, the handoff is super important. I've had success in this case, real success with this. In other cases, I've had, well, I guess, I don't know if failure is the right word, but a lot less success. This is super important, especially in a complex device. Handoff's the wrong word, because you have to stay involved for a long time, or it's just going to fail. So I think that it's critical. Again, I've seen this go both ways. So in this case, and this is a picture from one of the shows that we did with people from Parker, people from the Shepherd Center, and I'm there from Vanderbilt. But Parker hired our students. Right now they have three very good former PhD students that are part of that that are leaders of that technical team. So they brought with them a lot of corporate knowledge. Parker hired the clinical team that was part of this NIH grant. That was, I think, a huge benefit for them. I've remained involved and invested. I was very invested for a number of years. I'm slowly ramping down. I've continued to be engaged in design and in reviews, and frankly, I'm meeting with them. It's either next week or the week after they're coming to Nashville. So, and this is 7 years after licensing. So we continue to work on things together. And part of that is they've maintained a sponsored research agreement through our lab that helps us work together. So I think that's hugely important. And this is my last slide. These are kind of other lessons learned. And I did, as Peter mentioned, so I've licensed some other things. I'm also part of a founder of a startup now that's, instead of licensing out, these are two of my former students and postdocs that we're forming a company together. As I mentioned, I don't want to be too involved in the company because I like doing what I'm doing, and you can only do so many things. So, but in this case, the students are doing, they're not students, they're former students. They're doing the lion's share of the management. At any rate, here's 3 or 4 things I think are important. Reimbursement is huge. And it's really hard to, if there's not already a reimbursement code, it's really hard to get one. And that's one of the things I've learned. I had dinner in Switzerland a couple years ago with a good friend, and he had started a company, and most people know his name, but I won't tell you, because it doesn't matter. But he has started a company, raised $65–70 million, and it was acquired by another company. But at any rate, he said he tried and failed to get some reimbursement codes. If he had to do it again, he would start with the codes. And that's a little bit extreme. I don't know if you start with the codes, but you start with awareness of the codes. That's huge, and that should affect your decision. Regulatory issues, almost the same thing. If you can do, of course, if you're doing surgical robotics, it's not class 1. But if you can get a class 1 device, great. If you're going to do class 2 or 3, if there's a predicate, that changes substantially the amount of investment you're going to have to make. So the FDA trials are extremely expensive. Device simplicity. I mean, engineering and academia, we like to make things complex. This device, I have a picture here, just shows some of the electronics in the hip part. There's electronics in the legs. There's 7 microcontrollers in it that talk to each other. You know, we didn't make it overly complex. We tried to make it simple, but if I was going to go, well, I am going back with the startup and doing other devices. These are simpler devices. So if you can make something functionally simpler, you're much better off. And then I think the last point I would make is know who's going to be selling it and what their incentive is for doing so. That's a little bit more of the business model kind of issue, but I think that's these are all good things to keep in mind if you want to develop for commercialization. And that's basically that's I think a summary of my lessons learned, and I appreciate your time.
That was great, Michael. We have time for a couple questions. Okay. Here, go ahead.
Okay. One thing, the few times I've looked at rehabilitation market, it's always seemed like the price sensitivity to customers is really very sensitive. Have you found that? Can you talk a little about? You mentioned reimbursement, but the other thing is the actual
price,
cost or rental or whatever the devices can be pretty sensitive.
Yeah. Okay. So the question about cost. So I guess there are a couple of things. One is we do both. This startup that I have is prosthetics, and prosthetics there's a lot more headroom for price. Seemingly, I think part of that is because you can. A wheelchair does provide mobility. A wheelchair might be $2,000 or $3,000. If you maybe more, but if you're missing a lower limb, it's really hard to be mobile. And so I think insurance companies, for whatever reason, have put a higher price tag on those. So a $30,000 prosthetic limb is pretty standard in the U.S. Not exactly, but if you're an active person, that's acceptable. By the way, my comment about also kind of the regulatory issue, minimizing cost on the front end, and also simplicity is in part to try to make something as reasonably priced as possible so people can afford it and so it's accessible. With these exoskeletons, they're complex devices. The market's relatively small right now, and they are selling for roughly $30,000 to $35,000 for an exoskeleton for personal use, and then more than that for institutional use. There are different devices for institutional and personal use. I don't know what to say other than I'd like to see the price come down. I think projections are the prices can come down to $15,000 to $20,000, but for a device this complex that has a lot of development investment in it and FDA trial investment in it, and service and training to use it, I think it's hard. It might be hard for it to come down much less than that. If it is reimbursed, at least in the U.S., and reimbursement covers 80%. So then, if you have a $15,000 device, and then it basically ends up costing the user $3,000, and insurance would cover the rest. And I think that's reasonable. But I have no direct control over prices.
Okay, one last question.
So, Michael, one of the challenges with these systems is that they're supposed to work for thousands of cycles, unlike a surgical robot, which we're happy if a tool is used for 100 hours and then we replace it. So, when you're thinking about system costs, how much was it critical that you have the whole service costs as part of your business plan when you approach investors? That figured out, like how early did you have to figure this out?
Yeah, so that's a good question because I kind of said, well, benchtop testing is not sufficient, but then how far do you have to go in making a convince and de-risking something? And we would test actually to about 10,000 cycles, which let's say for prosthetics you need about 3 million probably is probably minimum. So we wouldn't test to that. that's something that we feel like a company can do. But it is important to have considered that. At least I'll say when we sit down with companies who are licensing, that's a question that they'll ask. And if there's some fundamental choice we've made in design that's going to limit cycles, that's a real problem. We have been asked before to show, can you do this number of cycles? And we've shown that. So how much, it's hard to say because there's a lot of factors you want to consider. I think that's something that you certainly need to consider in the design. It's something that somebody's going to ask about. If you've made design choices that are fundamentally going to limit life, that's a concern. But I've never been asked to show that your device can do 1 million or 2 million or 3 million cycles. That's a bit excessive. But once again, if you have flexures in there, that's like clear that they're going to go 150,000 and break, and that's a fundamental part of your device design. A company's probably going to say, no thanks, because again, they're paying for a package that's going to save them time and decrease their risk to market. And part of that decreased risk is technological risk. They want to know this basic design approach you've taken is one that all they need to do is commercially harden it, and otherwise they can basically go with the same thing. So something you need to consider, but you don't need to show 1 million, 2 million. I haven't in my experience. Okay. All right, thank you.
Let's thank Michael again.